When I turned 71, I sat in the lawyer's office and listened as my son's will was read. The two people who would inherit everything were his ex-wife and a woman I had never heard of. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, frozen, wondering how long I had been erased from my own family. But then I drove 6 hours into the forest, chasing a name I didn't know, and what I found in that cabin changed everything. I had just pulled the last apple pie out of the oven when the phone rang. That was always how it started with Daniel. A quiet moment, a warm kitchen, and then something that would crack the air wide open. I let the pie rest on the counter and wiped my hands on the same towel I had used for years. The call came from an Oregon number I didn't recognize. I answered it anyway. The voice on the other end was measured polite, too gentle for a stranger. He said he was Officer Claiborne from the Oregon State Police. Said my son had been found at the scene of a single car accident just outside Medford. Said it was instant. No pain, no foul play, just a quiet curve on a wet road that gave out beneath him. I stood there staring at the steam coming off the pie. The towel was still in my hand, clutched so tightly I couldn't feel my fingers. I didn't ask for more. I didn't ask for anything. I thanked him, hung up, and stood alone in the house Daniel had never seen. When you're 71 and your only child dies, no one quite knows what to say to you. They send flowers. They drop off food. They avoid asking if you're sleeping. The truth is you do sleep, because the body gives up before the mind does. You sleep because dreaming is easier than waking up to silence. I kept the pie wrapped in foil for 3 days. Couldn't bring myself to throw it out. Daniel always said mine were too tart, that I used too much lemon in the mix. He would eat every bite anyway, then ask for another. I baked that pie like I always had, with a quiet kind of love. The kind you don't need to speak out loud. I didn't call anyone, not even his ex-wife. I let the lawyer handle everything. There wasn't much family left to notify. His father had passed when Daniel was 15. My sister lived in Arizona, but we hadn't spoken in years. So it was just me. Me and the silence. Me and a pie I couldn't eat. I didn't cry that first day. Grief is strange. It doesn't always show up loud. Sometimes it just sits with you quietly, watching you move around your own house like a ghost. That night I slept on the couch with the TV on low just to hear voices. I watched a show about wild horses in Montana. One of them had a white stripe down its face that reminded me of Daniel's childhood dog. Funny the things your mind reaches for when it wants to feel something familiar. The next morning I made coffee, fed the birds, and waited for the call from the attorney. I knew it was coming, but I didn't expect what he would say. I didn't expect the words that would make Daniel's death feel even more confusing, even more distant. I didn't expect my son to have secrets, and I didn't expect my name to be missing. Not once, not even in passing. The lawyer's office smelled like lemon polish and old carpet. I sat in a chair that was too soft for its own good, across from a man named Carson Bell. He looked about my son's age, neatly dressed, wore a watch with a leather strap, and spoke with that tone people use when they're afraid the next thing they say might break you. He opened a file, said a few formal words, confirmed the time of Daniel's death and the jurisdiction of the estate. I nodded. I had nothing to add. My hands stayed in my lap. My purse sat by my feet like it knew not to speak either. Then he began reading the will. The first name didn't surprise me. Rebecca Hargrove, Daniel's ex-wife. They had been divorced 5 years now, but I knew he still sent her birthday cards and made sure the mortgage on her house was paid. That was Daniel. Even when things went bad, he tried to make them hurt less for other people. She was listed as beneficiary to his life insurance policy. $420,000. A clean round number. The second name came right after. Elsie Santiago. She would receive the house in Ashland, his investment account, and full rights to what the document called sentimental property. I didn't recognize the name, not even a flicker of familiarity. Carson paused, looked up like he expected me to say something. I didn't. I waited. My throat had gone dry somewhere between Elsie and Santiago. He went on to list other items: a storage unit in Grants Pass, a vehicle, some medical equipment, a few charitable bequests. None of it had my name on it. Not even the box of vinyl records Daniel and I used to listen to on rainy Saturdays. Not even the cookbook he stole from me at age 15 and never gave back. When he finished, Carson folded his hands and asked if I had any questions. I shook my head. He asked if I wanted a moment alone. I told him I would take a copy of the will and leave. Outside, the wind had picked up. I stood by the curb with the file pressed against my chest. People walked past with coffee cups and open calendars. Life didn't pause just because someone's heart gave out on a rainy road. My knees ached, but I didn't sit. Back at home, I spread the will across the kitchen table, read it twice, then a third time. There were no mistakes, no lines missing. I had been written out, not angrily, not cruelly, just completely. I opened the cupboard, pulled out a chipped mug, and poured myself a cup of weak coffee. I sat down and looked out the window. The bird feeder was still swinging from the wind. Somewhere out there was a woman named Elsie Santiago, and for some reason my son had given her the parts of himself I thought only I knew. I didn't cry. Not yet. There was something about seeing your name absent from a legal document that once would have listed you first. It was a different kind of grief. Not louder, just deeper, more settled. The pie was still on the counter. I threw it out that night, wrapped it up tight, walked it out to the bin like it was something dangerous, something better gone. Daniel never mentioned Ashland, not once. Not in phone calls, not in holiday cards, not in the handful of visits he managed each year. He talked about his patients, his morning runs, the new espresso machine he hated to admit he loved. But not a word about a second home. Certainly not a woman named Elsie Santiago. I sat at my dining table with the will on one side and a road map on the other. Ashland sat nestled near the bottom corner of Oregon, surrounded by pine and quiet. A long way from Tacoma, not just in miles. I traced the highway down with my finger, noted the rest stops, circled Medford. That was where the accident report had come from. That curve in the road just west of town. I folded the map, tucked the will into my bag, and packed an overnight bag without looking too closely at what I threw in. The drive south was quiet straight. Trees widened along the highway, and the sky got deeper the further I went. I passed signs for farms, fruit stands, and roadside chapels. There was time to think, which wasn't always a gift. I kept wondering how many Saturdays Daniel had spent in that house. Whether he had hung pictures, whether he had kept any of the old things from our home, whether he had smiled more there. It was late afternoon when I reached Ashland. The GPS led me through town, past a bookstore and a theatre marquee missing a few letters. Up a hill, the houses grew sparser, spaced between rows of fir trees. At the end of a narrow road, the GPS stopped. No more instructions. Just a gravel drive with a rusted mailbox that read Santiago in peeling black paint. I parked on the shoulder, left the engine running a moment, then turned the key and listened to the sudden silence. The air smelled of cedar and wood smoke. The house sat tucked behind a patch of wild garden, low-slung and modest, its porch sagging slightly in the middle. No sign of Daniel. no sound from inside. I climbed out, walked to the porch, and knocked once. Nothing. I waited, then knocked again, lighter this time. Still nothing. I stepped back. That was when I saw the child. She was standing at the edge of the trees near a worn path that led toward the back of the property. Her hair was dark and tangled, falling over her cheeks. She wore a navy sweater 2 sizes too big and no shoes. Her eyes were wide but not afraid. She looked at me like she had been told to expect someone. She held something in her hand, though I couldn't see what. She walked slowly up the path, not speaking. Then she said, clear and steady, "You're Sylvia." It wasn't a question, more like a confirmation of a fact already known. I nodded before I could stop myself. She stepped closer and looked me over head to toe like she was checking if I matched a picture. My dad said if you came, I should hug you. So I did. She wrapped her arms around my waist, small and certain. Her cheek pressed against my coat. I didn't move. I couldn't. My hands hung at my sides, useless. The hug didn't last long. She let go and stepped back, eyes still on me. He said you had soft hands and smelled like cinnamon. He said your stories had quiet endings. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Then the door opened behind us. A woman stepped onto the porch, one hand on the frame, the other holding a folded blanket. Her face was pale, her hair pulled back into a low knot. She looked at me without surprise, without welcome. "I'm Elsie," she said. That was all. Then she stepped aside, leaving the door open behind her, and disappeared into the house. The inside of the house smelled like pine, and something faintly sweet, maybe, from the wood-burning stove or the bread cooling on the counter. It was clean, but lived in. A child's sweater hung on a hook by the door. A basket of folded laundry sat half-finished near the couch. Books were stacked along the window ledge in uneven piles. Not a house prepared for guests. A house caught mid-breath. I stood in the doorway, unsure if I was meant to follow. Elsie had disappeared down the hallway without a word. The little girl walked past me like she belonged there, which of course she did, and curled up on the couch with a stuffed animal tucked under one arm. I stayed near the door. Part of me still expected someone to ask me to leave, or at the very least explain why I had come. But no one asked. No one offered tea or a chair. Silence filled the room the way wind fills tall grass. Soft, uninvited, and everywhere. Eventually Elsie returned. She had changed into a fresh sweater and pulled her hair back tighter. She sat in the armchair across from the couch and folded her hands in her lap. She looked younger than I expected. Early 30s, maybe. Her face was pale but steady. "He told me you might come one day." That was all she said. No preamble, no apology, just a simple sentence that hung in the air. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. She reached over to the end table and picked up a framed photo. It was Daniel, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, standing outside that same cabin smiling at something off camera. The girl was in his arms, laughing, one sock missing. His other hand rested on Elsie's shoulder. He looked happy, not just smiling, but whole. "We didn't mean to keep her a secret," Elsie said. Still she was. "I know," she said. The girl began to hum softly on the couch, running her fingers through the mane of her stuffed horse. Elsie watched her for a long time, then turned back to me. "Daniel didn't want you to carry this. The worry, the pain. He said losing your husband nearly broke you. He was afraid if you knew about the baby and her condition, it might undo you completely." I sat down then, not because I wanted to, but because my legs gave out in quiet stages. I gripped the edge of the coffee table to steady myself. My throat felt tight. My hands cold. What condition? Her heart. She has a ventricular septal defect, a hole between the chambers yours. Not uncommon, but hers is more complicated. It requires monitoring. Possible surgery. Daniel understood the risks. He'd seen the charts. He knew what the next years would look like. He lived here. With you, this whole time. 6 years. The words landed harder than I expected. 6 years. That meant birthdays, holidays, whole seasons I never knew existed for him. A life parallel to mine unfolding in a different direction. He left medicine, I said. Yes. Quietly. No announcement. He told everyone he was taking a sabbatical. He never went back. Did he still? He still loved you, Elsie said. He didn't stop. He just didn't want to put another weight on you. The girl had fallen asleep on the couch, her small face half buried in the pillow. One arm dangled off the edge, fingers curled loosely. I had imagined something ugly when I drove down here. Betrayal, a secret affair, a child born out of mistake or accident. What I found was quieter, sadder. He had loved, he had chosen to protect, and in doing so he had shut the door without ever slamming it. That might have hurt more. I didn't stay long that first evening. After the girl fell asleep and the light started to slip behind the treetops, I stood up. Elsie didn't offer a place to sleep. I didn't ask. There was a quiet understanding that none of us knew what came next. I drove back to a roadside inn a few miles outside town, a low wooden place with squeaky floorboards and a vending machine that only took exact change. I checked in under my full name, even though no one asked for it. The room smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old carpet, and the blankets were scratchy, but I was too tired to care. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling fan spinning in slow circles. My mind wouldn't settle. I kept thinking of the way the girl had curled up without a sound. How natural it all seemed. How deeply Daniel had rooted himself into that life, and how easily I had been left outside of it. There was no anger. That surprised me. Just a kind of deep, hollow ache that felt like bruised bone. I didn't know what role I had anymore. I wasn't a mother grieving the child she had raised alone. I wasn't a grandmother who had watched her family grow. I was something in between, present but not expected. The next morning, I bought a cinnamon roll and a cup of black coffee from a gas station up the road, ate the roll in the parking lot while watching the mist lift off the hills. Then I drove back to the cabin. No one was outside. I stood at the edge of the gravel and waited. The little girl appeared first, standing on the porch with one shoe on and a piece of toast in her hand. She waved without words. I lifted my hand in return. Elsie came out a moment later, pulling her sweater closed. She looked tired, but she nodded once, and that was enough. We sat on the porch for most of the morning. The girl played in the dirt with a few sticks and 2 small plastic horses. Elsie and I watched her, both of us sipping weak coffee from mismatched mugs, the kind of silence that held its own shape. She doesn't know much about him, Elsie finally said. Just stories, pictures, things I've told her. He didn't want to confuse her with half-truths or names she couldn't place. I understand, I said. And I did. More than I wanted to. She's strong, has to be. The doctors say her next scan will tell us more, but she hasn't been in pain. Not yet. I nodded again, then asked if she had help. Any family, not really. My mother passed 2 years ago. No siblings, just us. And a nurse who comes every 2 weeks to check vitals. Sometimes a neighbor helps when the snow gets too heavy. I looked at the girl. She had found a pine cone and was trying to balance it on the back of one of the horses. She was humming something tuneless and light. "He taught her to whistle," Elsie said. "Couldn't help himself. Said it was one of the first things he ever learned from you." I felt something tighten behind my ribs, a strange pressure, sharp and old. "I didn't come here to interfere," I said. "I know. I didn't come to claim anything. I know that too. But I think I need to come back tomorrow." Elsie looked at me then, fully, like seeing me not just as Daniel's mother, but as someone who might be staying longer than expected. She didn't smile, but her face softened. "All right," she said. We sat there a while longer. No more questions. Just the rhythm of a child's play and two women who had loved the same man in two different lifetimes. The next morning I brought banana bread, still warm, still in the pan. I had baked it in the tiny oven at the motel, half guessing at the temperature, hoping the old settings hadn't shifted too far off over the years. The top came out darker than I wanted, but the smell held steady. Butter brown sugar and something faintly familiar. I wrapped it in a towel and drove back up the gravel road. The girl saw me first again. She was sitting on the steps with a small tin lunchbox open beside her, sorting rocks by colour. When I parked, she lifted one of them in the air like a trophy, then dropped it back in the box and waved. Elsie opened the door before I could knock. Her eyes went straight to the bread. "That smells good," she said. "It might be a little overdone," I said, "but it's yours if you want it." She stepped aside to let me in. The house looked the same as the day before, just lived in a little deeper. A sock on the floor, a mug on the sill, the normal rhythm of people who are trying to get through the week. I sat at the same spot on the couch while the girl darted between the window and the toy box. Elsie moved through the kitchen, slicing the bread without speaking. The quiet didn't feel strained anymore, just necessary. When she brought over 2 plates and mugs, she hesitated before sitting down. "I want you to know something," she said. "Daniel talked about you. Not in long stories, but in pieces. He said you used to fix things when no one else could. Cabinets, hearts, bad moods. He said you were the one person who could make a kitchen feel like home." I looked down at the plate. Steam still floated off the slice. I had made it the way I always had. No nuts, a little cinnamon, the same way Daniel liked it when he was young. "I didn't know how much he needed you," she said, "until it was too late to give him more." I didn't answer. There was nothing to say that wouldn't feel too heavy for the moment. "He didn't want to burden you with this life," she said. "The appointments, the specialists, the not knowing. He told me once that after your husband died, a part of you went quiet, that he was afraid if he added more grief to you, it might take you under." She stood up, then pulled open a drawer near the table and came back with a folded paper. "It's her chart. Medical summary. I thought you should know the truth." I unfolded it with slow hands, familiar words. Terminology I hadn't read in years: holes between chambers, irregular flow, surgical risk. But also notes in the margins, Daniel's handwriting, his diagrams, the same pen marks he used on his school papers when he was 12. Circle, underline, asterisk. His way of managing the unknown. He took notes on everything I said. He did, Elsie said, even on how many hours she slept, even on which side of the bed made her breathing easier. I folded the paper carefully and handed it back. "She needs regular care," I said. "We're trying, I know." We sat in that room until the clock ticked past noon. The banana bread disappeared slice by slice. The girl fell asleep under a blanket on the rug, one hand still curled around a plastic horse. That afternoon before I left, I stood by the window looking out at the yard. There was a row of small wooden stakes in the garden, each one painted a different color. I realized they marked something, or maybe someone, and for the first time in years, I understood what it meant to witness a life from the outside and want to be let in, not to fix it, not to own it, but simply to be part of what came next. The letter came 3 days later. White envelope, thick paper, the return address, stamped from a law firm in Portland. Elsie found it in the mailbox and handed it to me without a word. I opened it on the porch with the morning sun still low and the sound of birds rustling somewhere in the trees. It was from the attorney representing Rebecca's family, Daniel's ex-wife. The letter used phrases like intent to contest and improper beneficiary. They were planning to challenge the will. Said the inclusion of Elsie and her daughter was based on emotional manipulation. Claimed Daniel had not been of sound mind at the time of revision. Claimed the child had no legal standing as next of kin. Elsie didn't speak while I read. She sat beside me on the top step, arms wrapped around her knees. When I was done, I folded the letter once clean and straight and held it in my lap. Rebecca had always been polite, the kind of woman who sent thank you notes and brought side dishes in covered glass. Even after the divorce, she and Daniel stayed civil. I thought she had moved on. Now I wasn't sure she ever let go of the idea that his life was still supposed to run parallel to hers. They think they can erase her, Elsie said finally. Her voice was flat, not angry but tired. They're going to try, I said. The next week moved in quiet inches. Elsie called the attorney Daniel had used to draft the will. He was still practicing, still sharp. He assured her they had a case, but it might get messy. Family disputes always did. The girl didn't understand what was happening. She colored pictures at the table, chased bugs near the fence line, asked when we could bake cookies again. Elsie smiled when she asked, said soon, and then went to the bedroom to cry, where the girl couldn't hear. One afternoon I stood in the hallway looking at the framed photos on the wall. One of Daniel and the girl sitting on a blanket under the trees eating orange slices. One of him hammering a nail into a garden bed, the girl watching from a few feet away with a plastic shovel in her hands. His handwriting labeled the back of each one. Dates, locations, notes on the weather. I remembered how careful he had always been with names. How he never labeled things he wasn't sure would last. The fact that he had written her name on the back of each picture told me everything. The attorney for Rebecca's family filed the first motion 2 days later. Claimed Daniel had been under undue influence, that his choices were clouded by romantic involvement, that Elsie had isolated him, prevented him from staying in touch with his rightful family. They used the word rightful twice in the same paragraph. The hearing would be scheduled soon. Elsie didn't ask me what I planned to do. She didn't pressure. But I could see it in her eyes every time I picked up my coat. That quiet, wondering if I would still be standing next to them when the courtroom doors opened. I had already made my choice. That evening I took a walk to the edge of the woods, where the pine trees grew close together, and the air smelled like damp soil. I stood there a long time with my hands deep in my coat pockets, listening to the wind and the hush of everything that came before this moment. Then I went back inside and sat down at the table with Elsie. I told her I would be staying through the hearing. I told her I would speak if asked. I told her I had no interest in fighting anyone, but I would not let them erase the only piece of Daniel still breathing in this world. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. We understood each other now in a way that didn't require words. Just presence. Just choice. Just the quiet promise to stay. The courthouse sat on a corner just off the town square. Brick building, 3 stories, the kind that looked heavier than it needed to be. I arrived early, wore a pressed blouse, black pants flats that wouldn't click across the floor. I sat on a bench outside the courtroom doors and waited. Elsie arrived 15 minutes later holding the girl's hand. She wore a grey sweater, simple and clean. The girl had a braid down the side of her head, tied with a red ribbon. Her boots didn't match. One had a faded star, the other a tear along the heel. She looked calm, though I could see her fingers twitching against her side. We didn't speak. The lawyer came out to greet us. A man in his 60s, slow-moving but alert. He walked Elsie through what to expect. Short hearing, statements, initial evidence review. No decisions yet, just the first step. The opposing counsel arrived next. Rebecca came with them. She wore a dark green coat and carried a folder under her arm. She didn't look at us. Her shoulders were straight, her lips drawn in tight. Behind her was her sister, someone I barely remembered from years ago. They stood together like two matching pieces. When they called us in, the room felt colder than the hallway. Wood paneling, high windows, a few rows of pew-like benches. We sat at the front to the right, Rebecca and her side to the left. The judge entered. Female, late 50s eyes, sharp behind thin glasses. She asked for clarity on the dispute. Rebecca's attorney stood read a prepared statement, argued that the will had been altered improperly, claimed emotional manipulation, suggested Daniel had not been mentally stable due to his isolation and sudden withdrawal from medical practice. Then our lawyer stood, calm voice, said the will was witnessed, signed and notarized according to law, said Daniel had lived openly with Elsie and the child for 6 years, said there were school records, medical records, signed affidavits from neighbors, said the choice was intentional and legal. They called me next. I walked to the stand slowly, took the oath, sat with my hands folded in my lap. I answered a few questions, confirmed that I was Daniel's mother, confirmed that I had not been listed in the will and was not contesting that fact. Then the judge asked if I had anything to add. I spoke simply. I said I had only learned about Elsie and the child after my son's death. I said that while I was surprised by the secrecy, I had come to understand why he made the choices he did. I told the court that I had seen the home. I had witnessed the care. I had read his notes in the margins of medical charts and heard stories only a father could tell. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a letter. Not one I wrote. One I found weeks earlier, tucked in an old paperback in Daniel's childhood box. It was addressed simply to my girl. Inside, in Daniel's handwriting, were 2 pages of gentle instructions and a paragraph that stopped me cold. He wrote, "If you ever read this, know that you are not a mistake, not a secret, not a shadow. You are my daughter, my choice, my joy. And if the world ever tries to deny you, remember that your father gave you his name because he wanted you to belong. Always." I handed the letter to the court clerk. Let it become part of the record. When I stepped down, Elsie didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the floor, hands tight in her lap. The girl was drawing on the corner of a notebook with a green pen, a small horse with wings. The judge recessed without comment, said she would review the evidence and reconvene with a ruling at a later date. We stepped back into the hallway. The sun had moved behind the building, casting the corridor in soft shade. I looked at the girl. She looked back, calm as ever. We walked outside, 3 of us in a line, into the cold afternoon air. Nothing had been decided yet. But something had shifted. Not in court, not on paper, but inside me. I no longer felt like a visitor. A week passed before the ruling. The letter came in a plain envelope, no heavier than a grocery receipt, though it felt like it should have weighed more. Elsie opened it in silence while I stood at the window watching the girls stack pine cones on the porch railing. The judge upheld Daniel's will, fully, without condition. Elsie would retain ownership of the cabin, the investments, and the personal items. The insurance claim would not be redirected. Most important of all, the court acknowledged the child as Daniel's legal heir, citing the handwritten letter and the documented care he had provided over the years. Elsie sat down after reading it and let the paper fall into her lap. Her shoulders didn't drop. Her breath didn't hitch. She just closed her eyes for a long moment. I watched her, thinking of how much she had held together for so long. Later that evening, I asked her if we could talk about the girl's future. Not about custody, not about titles, just about care, about security, about what came next, now that the court had closed its part. We sat at the table after dinner. The girl had fallen asleep in the armchair, knees pulled up, thumb resting near her mouth. I told Elsie I wanted to do something permanent, not just bake bread, or visit, or testify when needed. I wanted to put something in place that would last. She looked at me without blinking. No suspicion, no hesitation, just quiet listening. I said I had funds set aside, a savings account I hadn't touched since Daniel moved away, originally meant for emergencies. Then it became untouchable, a symbol of waiting for something I didn't know how to name. It held just over $250,000. I told her I wanted to create a trust in the girl's name, not for anyone to dip into, not for vacations, or comfort. For medical care, for specialists, for second opinions and long-term follow-ups. The trust would be overseen by an independent advisor, but I would be named guardian of the account, not because I wanted control, but because I wanted responsibility. Elsie didn't interrupt. She only asked one thing, whether this meant I was staying. I told her yes, not as a guest, not as a visitor, as family. We filed the paperwork 2 days later. A lawyer in town helped us structure the trust. Clean, specific binding. The girl's full name was listed as the beneficiary. The documentation included a letter I wrote in my own hand, explaining why the trust existed and what I hoped it would protect. That afternoon, I took the girl to the library in town. She picked out a book about stars and one about horses. She fell asleep in the car on the way home, with her head against my arm, her breath slow and steady. When we got back to the cabin, she climbed into Elsie's lap without a word. I handed Elsie the folder with the final trust documents. She held it to her chest, nodded once, and whispered something into the girl's hair. That night, I sat on the porch alone. The wind moved through the trees like it had somewhere to be. The house behind me was quiet. No more court dates, no more questions. Just a child asleep in her bed. A woman who no longer had to fight for a name. And me. A mother who had given everything once and still had more to give. Not to fix, not to reclaim, but to continue. Quietly, fully. In a way Daniel would have understood, autumn came slowly that year. The mornings crisped little by little, the leaves turning a muted yellow before the reds arrived. I began wearing thicker sweaters in the mornings, folding extra blankets at the foot of the girl's bed at night. The garden died back quietly, and the pine trees stood a little stiffer in the wind. The girls started kindergarten in the small town down the hill. Every morning Elsie packed a lunch and tied the same red ribbon in her hair. I stood on the porch most days, watching as they pulled away in the old car with the cracked mirror. Some mornings, the girl waved through the back window until the trees swallowed the road again. We had settled into a rhythm. I stayed in the spare room which once had been Daniel's office. The walls still held faint nail marks where photos had hung. I didn't cover them. I left the space bare except for the small desk and an old lamp I brought from home. I cooked most evenings. Nothing fancy. Just warm food in steady portions. Elsie worked part-time at the bookstore in town, and the hours suited her. quiet, reliable. She came home with her hands smelling of paper and dust. We didn't speak much over dinner, but there was comfort in the silence. One night after the girl went to bed, Elsie brought out a cardboard box I hadn't seen before. She placed it on the kitchen table, then sat down without opening it. "It's everything he kept," she said. "Things I didn't know what to do with. Maybe you'll know." Inside were pieces of a life. A weathered leather wallet, with his initials still faintly visible. A collection of ticket stubs from concerts I never knew he attended. A pack of recipe cards, in his handwriting, most of them for soups. Photos, some from his college years, others more recent. None of me. I didn't take it personally. Daniel had created two lives, one rooted in memory, the other built on distance. It was not a rejection, just a shift I hadn't seen coming. Near the bottom of the box was a smaller envelope, my name written in the corner in his handwriting. Not Mum, just Sylvia. I opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, short, tidy. His words clipped, careful, but filled with something I hadn't felt in years. He wrote that he had made choices I might not understand, that he had carried guilt for not telling me about Elsie and the child, that he had been scared, not of me, but of hurting me again. He remembered the months after his father died, the silence, the way my hands shook when I thought no one was looking. He said he didn't want to add more weight. He closed with a line I read 3 times before I folded the letter. "You taught me that love is what you build when no one is watching." I placed the letter back in the envelope and returned it to the box. I didn't need to read it again. It had already settled somewhere deep, a quiet space I hadn't known was still open. That night, I stood at the edge of the porch and looked out toward the trees. The wind was colder now, the sky clear. The stars had come back faint and steady. I stood there a long while thinking not about what I had lost, but about what had stayed. Some grief never softens. Some absences remain loud. But sometimes in the middle of it all, something quiet and whole begins to form. Not to replace what was gone, but to remind you that love once rooted can stretch far beyond the life that planted it. The article ran on a Sunday. Small feature bottom half of the local section. A photo of the girl in her schoolyard, laughing as she reached for the monkey bars. The headline read, "Local family receives quiet gift." Beneath it, a few paragraphs told the story of the medical trust, the court decision, and the grandmother who stepped forward when things could have unraveled. I hadn't asked to be interviewed. The reporter had spoken to the lawyer, pieced things together from public records, and filled in the rest with polite assumptions. They spelled my name right. That was enough. By noon that day, a few neighbors had stopped by. One brought a plate of cookies, another offered a winter coat they no longer needed. No questions, no pity, just presence. One woman, maybe late 60s herself, pressed my hand and said, "What you did was right." I didn't ask what she meant. We both understood. Elsie kept the paper folded neatly slipped between 2 books on the shelf. She didn't say much about it. Neither did I. We didn't need the world to clap. We only needed the world to stay out of the way. That week, the school nurse sent a note home. The girl would need a full cardiac scan before the holidays to update her medical file. I offered to take her. Elsie had a shift at the store. We didn't make a big thing out of it. We drove in silence most of the way. The girl stared out the window, humming under her breath. I had packed a peanut butter sandwich and 2 apple slices for afterward. I had remembered to bring her favorite socks, the ones with tiny foxes in case the room was cold. At the clinic, the technician was kind. She explained each step in plain words, let the girl squeeze a soft dinosaur while the monitor beeped quietly. I I sat beside the bed and watched the screen. I didn't understand what I was seeing, but I watched anyway. Afterward, as we walked back to the car, the girl reached up and took my hand. No words, just fingers wrapping around mine, small and steady. Back at the cabin, Elsie had lit the fireplace. She met us at the door, took one look at her daughter's face, and knew everything was fine. I handed her the packet of papers. She nodded, slid them into the drawer, and returned to stirring the pot on the stove. Later that night, I stepped outside with my tea and sat on the porch swing. The air had turned cold enough to sting the tips of my fingers. Across the yard, the trees stood still under the weight of early frost. Inside, I could hear the low rhythm of a child's voice reading out loud. I had once imagined the end of my life would be quieter, smaller, maybe an apartment somewhere with a view of a parking lot, meals for one, phone calls on Sundays that lasted less than 10 minutes. Instead, I had a room filled with children's books, mismatched cups, a coat rack that always had something drying on it, a calendar with school events circled in red. I hadn't expected this version, but it had found me. Not loud, not fast, just patiently. That evening, I didn't think about loss. I thought about continuity, about what carries on without asking, about what love looks like when it isn't owed but offered, what stays when no one is looking. The first snow came early that year, light at first, then steady, layering the trees in quiet white. I stood at the window that morning, mug in hand, watching the girl press her fingers to the glass and trace tiny circles into the fog. Behind her, Elsie folded blankets and set out the winter boots near the fire. We didn't talk much that day. Snow does that. It hushes everything, even the spaces inside you. I spent most of the morning in the kitchen peeling apples for pie. The girl sat at the table drawing. She said nothing, just handed me each finished picture as if it were an offering. By late afternoon, the house had that smell I remembered from years ago, butter cinnamon and something warm you can't quite name. I pulled the pie from the oven and set it on the counter. Steam rose in slow ribbons. The girl stood beside me, small and quiet. "This is how Daniel liked it," I said. "Not too sweet." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She reached up and touched the edge of the pie dish with one finger, then leaned her head against my side. Elsie joined us at the table as the sun disappeared behind the trees. We ate in silence, three people with nowhere else to be. Outside, the snow kept falling. After dinner, the girl climbed into my lap with her book. She didn't read, just curled against me, thumb in her mouth, the way Daniel used to when storms passed through. I rested my hand on her back, felt her breathing slow. That night after she was in bed, Elsie and I stood together at the sink. She washed. I dried. No conversation. Just the clink of plates, the steady rhythm of shared space. When I went to bed, I paused at the doorway, looked back once. This wasn't the life I expected. But it was the life I chose. And somehow through everything it had chosen me back. If you've ever felt forgotten or erased by someone you loved, I hope this story reminded you that healing doesn't always come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes it grows quietly in a place you never thought to look. If this story stayed with you in any way, I'd love to know. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or simply take a quiet breath and hold space for your own story. We're all trying to find our way back to something or someone, maybe even ourselves.